Hello, and welcome to Instant Insights, Global Data's strategic intelligence podcast. At Global Data Strategic Intelligence, we track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes impacting all major sectors. I'm Stu Robarts, and today, following the announcement that the UK's autumn budget will take place on the 26th of November, we're discussing the country's economy. UK economic performance has underwhelmed for a decade and a half now, with the 2008 financial crisis, subsequent austerity measures, Brexit, and the COVID-19 pandemic all having been pointed to as contributory factors. But can the UK's economic fortunes be turned around? And if so, what needs to be done? With me today to help answer those questions is Stephen Barber, Professor of Global Affairs at the University of East London. So, Stephen, thanks for joining us. As we approach this government's second budget, where does the UK find itself economically?
The British economy finds itself really in a very difficult position, I think. I think at the time of the first budget, it was clearly in a difficult position, and the Chancellor took decisions in that budget to stabilise public finances, which I think she hoped and in fact articulated that would be a one-off. The increase in national insurance at the heart of it, and that sort of 40 billion or so additional tax take, and I think she had hoped that would be the government taking the unpopular decisions early on, so that come the second budget, they could be much more focused on the strategy of delivering the sort of things that they want to deliver, and in particular, working on the broader economy rather than simply stabilizing public finances. But a year on, in fact, more than a year on, we find ourselves in another difficult position where there is another black hole in the budget in public, similar sort of magnitude to the one that was faced on the government. That is for reasons that of government. We're living in a very volatile world. We've had two and the tariff regime, but the challenge remains. And in one sense, that challenge to deal with the immediate problems of balancing the budget contrast a little bit with the broader strategic challenge that the government faces, which is to restore the British economy to a seriously growing economy that creates prosperity. And so she has these two challenges, really. And she's one of the reasons why I think the budget's been pushed back as far as really they can send it, which is that, yes, she's got to stabilise public finances, and that's an immediate challenge. But there's a bigger picture here and a bigger challenge, which is how do you work with the economy as it is now to put it in a position where it will grow really at the sort of levels that we were seeing before the financial crisis, rather than this kind of anemic levels that we've seen really for the decade and a half since.
Yeah, and just to touch on that, how much of the UK's persistent recent low growth is due to the likes of the financial crisis, austerity, Brexit, and the pandemic? And how much of the issues, if you like, are more deep-rooted?
Well, I think probably the first thing to say is that Britain's not an isolated case. So if you look around Europe at the moment, look at France, look at Germany in particular, there are similar discussions going on, which are not growing at the rate that they once did, and at the rate that is required to manage those economies. And there's similar debates as well about sustaining public spending in those economies. And then again, if you look around the world a volatile place at the moment. There's a lot of uncertainty. Many of the barriers that we had seen come down over the sort of globalization since the 1990s have started to re-emerge. So there's a slowdown of that kind of global growth. But Britain has its own particular problems, and I think you rightly pinpointed the global financial crisis there as that moment where things changed in Britain. I mean, Britain grew something like 10 times faster in the 16 years before the financial crisis than it has in the 16 years. And it's never really of that growth. Britain was quite heavily exposed to the global financial crisis because of its reliance, which obviously has been very successful, but the reliance on banking and financial services. But the sectors of the economy which were hit longer term were those that are particularly the parts of the country which a lot more low skilled or no skilled work. And those are the areas that saw unemployment rise. Now, the jobs, for the most part, kind of came back, but they came back as more precarious, lower paid, and all the rest. And so we have a situation where when you look at things, say, like net contribution to tax, actually the only net contributors to tax is London and the Southeast, if you look across the UK economy, and that's really unsustainable. And some of that came from the global financial crisis. But you're right as well. We also had Brexit, which has clearly damaged the UK economy. We are poorer as a result of that. It's hit productivity. It's hit trade. And of course, it was a distraction from other things that we might have been doing, compounded then by COVID and lockdown. So we've had a tough time of it. And of course, I would also point to a couple of governments, that the Johnson government and the very short-lived Liz Truss administration, which created a lot more uncertainty, and it was something of a circus of administrations which either caused damage in the actions that they pursued, or simply disincentivized investment. If there's that level of volatility and uncertainty, who's going to commit to say, yeah, well, I'm going to invest serious amounts of money in this plant or this part of the country or whatever it might be. So it's a combination of things.
You touched earlier on what Rachel Reeves will be looking at to try and stabilize the economy and reverse some of these trends in the upcoming budget. To your mind, what levers does she have at her disposal to pull, partly given the economic reality and also some of the political reality, I guess?
Well, yeah, I mean, let's slightly break it down to those two challenges. So there's the immediate challenge. She's got to balance the books, and then there's the more strategic challenge of how do you create a more prosperous Britain, a Britain that where the economy is more productive and is growing and all the rest. And her immediate problem, well, in fact, for both of those, the levers that she has at her disposal are limited. I think more limited than almost any other chancellor I can think of in comparable history. And when it comes to that first challenge of balancing the books and stabilizing public finances, although we're looking at a very complex economy and situation, the options available to her are relatively limited, and they range from cutting spending, and the government has suffered a setback there. When you look at the big ticket items for public spending, current spending at the moment, it's pensions, healthcare, and it's welfare. And actually coming fast up, catching up with those, although some way behind still, is debt interest. And we're spending something like 100 billion now each year on servicing the debt. And that's more than we spend on defence, for instance, or transport. And so it's significant when you think of things like transport as being areas where you have capital spending as well. That's quite important. And of course, the government suffered something of a setback because it tried to arrest the growth in welfare spending and suffered a political revolt of its own backbenchers. Now, there's some sign that they want to have another go at that with this reshuffle, and you can see how the Prime Minister has bolstered his own position in terms of influencing economic policy in the government, put in new ministers, particularly around welfare, where there could be more serious reforms. So they might want to have another go at that. And I think that's probably something that they have to look at, simply because otherwise it's very difficult to see where the money's coming from. Alternatives are, of course, to borrow more. Problem with that is, as I've just alluded to, borrowing is now becoming more unsustainable, and the cost of borrowing has risen quite substantially. So the government won't want to add to its borrowing any more than it seriously has to. And of course, it's constrained by its own fiscal rules, which is supposedly covering current spending by by income. And then you're left with tax. And the problem with tax is that, of course, as you said at the beginning, last year there was a budget, and it was quite a serious tax-raising budget, which was intended as a one-off. The Treasury has been kite flying now for weeks, coming up with all sorts of unpopular ideas of where it might find some cash here and cash there in order to fill the hole in spending, and each one gets discussed at length over the week in the media, and by the end of the week it's seen as unsustainable. There's a deputy leadership contest for the Labour Party at the moment, of course, and one of the favoured policies within the membership of Labour is a wealth tax. So I dare say that will emerge as another discussion point. But none of these really are satisfactory ways of raising the income that's required. I mean, in many ways, the fairest way of raising taxation would be on income tax. It's much related to the ability to pay. It's fair in that sense, and also we've kind of engaged in a, not intentionally, I would say, a restructuring of income tax over the last few decades or a couple of decades, which has meant that there are increasingly fewer people net contributing to tax because of the way we've brought up the tax-free allowance. We've brought down the thresholds a little, although there's of course the sort of fiscal drag of those each budget, and so you've got fewer people with a stake in that of the services that they're getting. So there's a good argument for doing that and properly strategically looking at how we tax and how we make sure it's progressive and how we make sure it's fair. But again, politically, that's largely off the table because the Labour Party went into the last election and perfectly understandable reasons ruled out increasing the main rates of tax. In fact, I think no government or no party has been elected to government promising to increase income tax, I think, since 1974. So it's not, you can see the political reality of that. So she's in a very difficult position, which I think is why they've pushed back the budget to the end of November. They're hoping that there might be some better news, that a bit of an uptick in growth, a bit of an uptick in productivity will ease the give a bit of headroom and ease the challenge. But it's very, very difficult.
Looking beyond this budget and perhaps numerous other budgets, are there any longer term strategies, or what longer term strategies do you think the UK can look to pursue in trying to encourage perhaps more sustainable and longer term growth?
I mean, I think that's the other challenge, and there's no quick fix with that. I mean, I know that there's a few more populist politicians. It's just this. So, on the left, it's well, we need the wealth tax. On the left, on the right, it's that we need to cut taxes altogether. And none of these things are going to solve that problem. So sort of beware of simple solutions to complex problems. If they were that easy, we would just do them. I mean, you open that with looking back on previous budgets. I think if you look right back, 4 decades or so ago, we sort of took a decision in Britain to a consumer economy rather than an investment economy. I think that was confirmed really in our response to the global financial crisis, where there was, for good reasons in many ways, a squeeze in public spending. But when we squeeze public spending, actually, the area, one of the parts of spending that we squeezed first, because it was easier politically, actually, in many ways, was capital spending. It's easier to say, well, we won't build that road that we were going to build. That's a politically easier decision than to say, well, we're going to cut what you're currently receiving. But of course, capital spending creates growth, and particularly up and down the country, where we do need to see a more evenly spread of prosperity. Again, the later government, the Johnson government, was elected in 2019 on the back of this idea of levelling up, and I think in many ways that had some salience. I think the problem with it was that it turned out to only be a political slogan. It was a very clever way of creating or exploiting a cleavage within the electorate to win an election when the government subsequently took office, it had no intention of doing anything about it. In fact, the levelling up department run by Michael Gove, I think, gave money back to the Treasury. That the select committee that looked into it said there's no visible outcome from the policy. So it's a shame in a way, because it was important to say, well, actually, we do need to find ways of creating prosperity up and down the country. So I think that there's a longer term challenge here, which is to say, well, could we become an investment economy? Can we be more bold than simply sort of tinkering around and moving the levers? And that's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in a year. It probably won't happen in a parliament. But you could see that if you get some consistency in policy, if you have the idea that you have a realistic industrial strategy, which is coordinated by the whole of government, that if you invest in skills, that if you exploit the digital revolution that's now upon us, then there's real opportunities to do it. And in that sense, Britain's pretty well placed. It's a free, open, democratic economy. It has strong skills base, strong education base, strong universities around the country. It could really do something meaningful here. And part of the problem, I think, has been with industrial strategies. Well, I mean, go back to the Thatcher government. Thatcher contemplated abolishing the Department of Trade and Industries. It then was, because the dogmatic approach to that government, as you'll know, was really the market decides. The market will allocate assets. But ever since really the 1990s, and Michael Heseltine, Peter Mandelson, then in the Blair government, later with Vince Cable in the coalition, even through the May and Johnson years to some extent, and certainly now, there's always been this sort of industrial strategy. They never kind of take off, is the problem. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that it can't just be the Department of Industry or the Department of Trade or Innovation doing it. It's coordinated across government, and all of those departments have got to be bought into the mission of, well, let's create an investment economy, create a growth economy. And you asked for an example. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, Britain won a quite important contract to supply naval vessels to the Norwegian Navy. Now, there's a really good example that there's a long-term contract. There's a lot of jobs, a lot of skilled work involved in that. Now, shouldn't the whole of the government be coordinated in order to make that a success? So are we producing school leavers and graduates with the skills that are required to do not just in those shipyards but around it, supplying the components, supplying are people setting up businesses in order to innovate, to create? And you could then see how that would be a much more powerful thing than well, we need a component, we'll buy it from overseas. And the same is true of the sort of spending that the British government does. Are we looking long term over the sort of things that we're going to do strategically? And I think probably defence is one area that we know is going to grow in importance. Well, are we investing in the sort of skills so that in 10 years, when the next generation of work needs to, that we have the skills, that we have the businesses that are operating around the big contracts to exploit and to advance and all the rest. And I think that's where industrial strategies for 30 odd years now have never reached their potential. It's not just what they wanted to do and the detail of the strategies, which they're all relatively comparable. Is it the central mission of government, and have you got a government that's coordinated so that you can deliver that?
Stephen, that's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. Thanks very much. I think that's all we've got time for today, but it's been super having you on. Thanks for taking the time.
A pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks again. again to Stephen for those insights, and thanks to you for listening. From all of us at Global Data Strategic Intelligence, see you next time.